Hello, today we're starting our water resources unit, and this will be the first lecture in that. This goes along with chapters 13 and 21 in your book. So water is very important for so many reasons, and while this may be poking fun at it a little bit, if you really take a look from space at our planet, you'll see that's the defining factor. We're a blue planet because we have water over 3/4 of our surface. And water is so important because it helps shape our continents, it moderates our climate, it allows organisms to survive. Most organisms are made up of between 60 and 75% water, so it's an incredibly important compound for life. And really, life could not exist without water. Now, water is so important because of its chemical properties. And the most important chemical property of the water molecule is its polarity. Its polarity allows it to hydrogen bond to other water molecules and to other compounds. So I want you to pause here for a second and go and watch that 3-minute video that I gave you the link for, and that's going to explain why this polarity and hydrogen bonding is so important. Alright, so that polarity and that hydrogen bonding is making all of these things possible. Cohesion, adhesion, which they talked about in the video, that high surface tension, which allows things to float on or walk across the surface. Capillary action, which is allowing plants to pull water up from their roots. It allows it to be less dense as a solid. It's the only solid that is less dense than its liquid form. All other compounds get more dense as they become solid state. And that allows ice to do some unique things. And it also gives it a very high specific heat. It's very hard to break the bonds between the water molecules, and that helps it act as a cooling agent also. It takes a lot of energy to break those bonds and to evaporate water, and because it takes so much energy, it sucks that energy out of the environment that it's in, so it can cool things down very effectively. Alright, so probably the biggest property of all that it makes possible, though, is the solvent properties. It's known as a universal solvent because it can dissolve almost anything. Anything that has any sort of charge, whether it's polar or if it's an ion like salt, it will dissolve these things. The only things it's not going to dissolve are nonpolar molecules like oils. So the other thing that kind of goes along with this solvent property that's really important, and you should remember all of this stuff from biology hopefully, is its ability to do osmosis, to diffuse through a membrane. And remember that when water diffuses through a membrane, it goes in the direction wherever there's more solute. So wherever there's more stuff to dissolve, the water's going to go that way to try to even out the concentrations of the solute. And it's small and polar and able to get through that membrane to do that. So when I teach this in biology, we always talk about how solutes suck. They suck the water towards them. And that's an important thing to remember here too. Right? So because it's able to dissolve things, it does dissolve a lot of substances, including salt. And that's why most of the water on Earth is saline. It picks up the salts from the sediments and from the rocks, and it dissolves them. And that's most of your ocean water, is this saline, this salt water. If you look at the chemical composition of seawater, salt water, you'll see that it is mostly water, and then the rest is these salts, which is mostly chloride, mostly sodium chloride is sea salt, but you also have some potassium salts, calcium salts, magnesium salts in there as well, and sometimes they will combine with sulfates instead of chlorine. Now, an important thing to know about seawater is it does provide an important habitat for all of those marine organisms. And remember, it does act like a carbon sink also. But unfortunately, it's not potable. And what potable means is drinkable. So you cannot drink seawater. In fact, it will dehydrate you faster than not drinking anything at all. So that's a major issue when we're talking about organisms trying to get a source of water. They can't use the seawater that covers 3/4 of our planet. Now, if we actually start looking at the fresh water on Earth that might be available to them, it's less than 3% of all of our water. So you can see seawater makes up most of that water. And then even that 2.5% that's fresh water, most of it is not available to organisms. If you look, most of it is actually frozen in the ice caps and in the glaciers. And then out of what's left that's not frozen, a lot of it is trapped in the ground as groundwater. And then only very, very little is actually at the surface. And even the stuff that's at the surface is not distributed evenly throughout the planet. You have some areas that are very dry and some areas that are very wet. So what that all results in is there's very little potable or drinkable water available to these organisms. And next time we're going to start to look at some of the problems that this causes, some of the conflicts in human populations that this can cause, but also conflicts for other organisms. So if you actually look at the way water is distributed, this graph shows you basically the percentage of the water that's available to each of these countries, and then the human population, that's the percentage of the entire world population that these countries make up. So you can see that for a lot of them, they have a higher population than they have water resources, essentially. And this is what causes a lot of the major conflicts throughout the world, is this difference in that natural capital, because they don't all have the same access to resources. Right, so when we're talking about water, we've talked a little bit about the difference already between saltwater and freshwater. So freshwater is going to have a lot less dissolved molecules in it, and particularly salts. And then there is this water in between that we call brackish water. So that's where this freshwater meets the seawater. That usually happens in estuary areas. So it's where a river is meeting the ocean. Usually you'll have this estuary in between them. And at that point you have brackish water where they start to mix together. And this actually turns out to be very important habitat as well. So a lot of this stuff that we're going to talk about here, we did already talk about in your second unit. And what I would do if I were you is try to flip back and find those notes, or if necessary, even go back and rewatch the video on the hydrologic cycle. And these are some words that you really need to be familiar with from that unit. So remember also from that unit that the water cycle, or the hydrologic cycle, is constantly collecting and purifying and redistributing all of our water throughout the world. And it does that because of the solar radiation causing these convection currents and temperature and pressure differences. And remember, we get those different cells of air moving around and different fronts that bring rain and weather patterns like that. And that all redistributes our water. So remember, these are our basic kind of steps in that water cycle. Now, a couple of really important things here, and this was part of your list. We really need to understand what runoff is now. So any of that surface water that's flowing over the soil, over the rocks, over the ground, the pavement, all of that is runoff. And that's going to carry a lot of pollutants and things like that with it. It's also going to cause a lot of erosion. Then we have infiltration or seepage. That's the water that's starting to soak down, or what we call percolate, into the soil, just like you percolate coffee and it soaks down through the ground. And then it can evaporate from the soil, or it can percolate down and join a stream system or the groundwater. Remember that groundwater is any water that's underground, and that's usually stored in an aquifer, which is kind of that underground reservoir of water beneath the surface. So also remember that when rain falls on an area, it falls into basically the highest elevations, and then it trickles down to the lower elevations. So that whole area that catches all of the water is called the watershed, or the drainage basin. And it's basically defined by the highest elevations all the way around it that kind of catch that water. It's the area that all that water drains from. So that usually comes down from the ridge lines. So when you see stream systems, they will start at the headwaters, which are way up high in elevation, and that's where the stream actually starts. And we'll talk about where that comes from in a second. And then they will start to run down in elevation until they get out to eventually the ocean. So the tributaries are all those little streams that start up from the headwaters and then flow into the larger stream and eventually into the river. When we're talking about upstream, we're talking about closer to those headwaters, closer to where it originates from. And when we talk about downstream, we're talking about further on, closer to where it's actually going to empty out into the larger body of water. A floodplain is any area that naturally this stream or this river is going to flood periodically and overflow its banks. And remember that estuary is where the fresh water is going to meet the salt water, and you're going to get that brackish mix. You should also remember that the headwater streams tend to be very narrow because they're starting off small. They move quickly. The water is clear and cold. It doesn't have a lot of nutrients because it hasn't picked them up yet, but it has a lot of oxygen. So headwater streams are very clean and pure and make very good habitats for most organisms. Then as it starts to go downhill, it starts to do what we call meanders. It meanders back and forth and it looks like a snake. And that basically is nature's erosion prevention. These meanders, these snake-like swirls, help to keep it from totally washing out the soil in an area, and slow down the water as well so that it's not as destructive. But once we get down towards these meanders and downstream, you tend to have wider rivers or streams. They move slower because of this meandering pattern. They tend to be cloudy because they've picked up a lot of sediment by this point. They're warmer. They've been moving quite a bit, so they've picked up lots of nutrients, and they tend to be less oxygenated because it is warmer, and warm water holds less oxygen in general. That's kind of an important point to write down. Things are just less, gases are less soluble in warmer waters. Right, so with our groundwater, remember we talked about most of it is stored in these aquifers. So when we talk about groundwater in these aquifers, there's a couple words that go along with this. So if we talk about discharge from an aquifer, that's any time that we're getting water basically out of the aquifer. So you're discharging it if you're drilling a well. It naturally discharges in a couple of places. It discharges into the ocean, wherever that aquifer meets the ocean, and then it can also discharge by forming streams at those headwaters. All ground is permeable to a certain extent, so the permeability of the ground, or basically the how many pores that it has in it that water can flow through, is going to determine how much water actually gets down into that aquifer. If the ground is saturated, that means it can't possibly hold more water. And in that case, it's probably not very permeable because the water is just kind of sitting there. It's not percolating through. And at that point, when it's saturated, we call it the water table. So sometimes when you'll dig down, you'll hit water at some point, and it'll just keep filling up your hole, and you've hit the water table. At that point, you're getting down into that groundwater, and you're eventually getting down into that aquifer. So a lot of houses and things like that in the south, they can't have basements because it would be dug down into that water table. They'd be getting down into the groundwater. Right, so when we build wells, we're usually trying to tap that aquifer, tap that groundwater, and we have to get it down far below the water table so that it won't dry up. So there's two major types of aquifers you need to know about. An unconfined aquifer is one that has a permeable water table, meaning that it can change quite a bit because the soil lets water through very easily. So it's pretty easy to get into, but the other risk is that the water table in that unconfined aquifer might change pretty dramatically also. And then you have confined aquifers, which are also known as artesian aquifers, and these are kind of trapped in place. There's a less permeable layer of like solid rock over them, and it's under pressure. So these are hard to get into. It's very expensive to dig what we call an artesian well that taps into that confined aquifer. But the benefit of that confined aquifer is it's less likely to be contaminated because things can't just seep down from the soil. They're not going to get through that layer of rock. So some of these aquifers are going to be replaced by precipitation, but if it's a confined aquifer, it might not be, because it might be so trapped down there that if you use it up, it doesn't come back as easily. All right, so in our first couple of units, we talked about aquatic ecosystems, and I just want to kind of go over some of these words again that we talked about there, because some people have been having trouble remembering them, and I've heard a lot in the review sessions that they need some more help with them. So remember that in aquatic ecosystems, our big division is freshwater versus saltwater ecosystems. But both types have three categories of organisms. The plankton are the ones that just kind of float around in the water. They don't move very much on their own. The nekton are the ones that are swimming very strongly. These guys tend to be in the middle of the water column. The plankton tend to be kind of throughout, but usually more towards the top, especially if they're phytoplankton, which are photosynthesizing. And then you have the benthic organisms, or the benthos, which are bottom dwellers. They live on the bottom and will not come up higher than that. I also want to remind you about the three zones in a lake or a pond. So the littoral zone is the one right on the shoreline. So you're going to get a gradual change here in depth, and it really allows a lot of species to be here. So these are really high productivity areas, high species richness areas. Then you have this limnetic zone, which is kind of out more in the middle of the lake, but still towards the top layer. So you can still have photosynthesis going on here. You tend to have a lot of larger fish because it's a deeper area. So you have that full food chain. And then the profundal zone down the bottom is the very bottom layer that usually does not get any oxygen. So it's anoxic, it's anaerobic, and this is usually dominated by decomposers, things like bacteria that don't need oxygen to survive. Also want you to remember that these lakes or ponds are thermally stratified, and what that means is they have layers of different temperatures that changes as you go down in depth, and that's called a thermocline when that happens. Another important environment to remember is wetlands. There are three basic things that tell us that a place is a wetland. One, the land has to be wet, at least part of what we call the growing season, the normal season where you have plants and everything living their normal lives. Number two, it has to have hydric soils. Hydric is H-Y-D-R-I-C. And that basically means that they hold water all the time, and they usually have very high clay content in order to hold on to that water, and they have a low oxygen content. There's so much water that not much oxygen can get in there, so they have very high incidences of anoxic soil. They also, characteristically, the third thing that defines them is they will have these typical wetland plants and animals. Now, wetlands are super important because of all the things that they do. So they kind of absorb all the groundwater, and they absorb water from local streams, and it helps to slow down that water so that it doesn't cause as much erosion. And then it takes all of the sediments and pollutants that come in with that water, and it filters them out, and it uses them in these plants for the plants to grow, and it feeds them into this wetland food chain. And then that provides habitat for lots of different organisms. Lots of organisms breed in these areas. This slow decomposition process of all those nutrients coming in creates really nutrient-rich soil, so it's a really productive ecosystem. And then the water that comes out of a wetland is much, much cleaner, and it can then be released back into a stream or into an estuary as a much more pure source of water. So benefits of wetlands, of course, they filter out that sediment and pollutants, they slow down the stream, they help retain water if you have a dry period like a drought, they provide lots of open space for organisms, and they prevent flooding. So all of these things, very important ecosystem services that are provided by wetlands. And if we remove wetlands, we notice that we have to spend a lot of money to do all of these things for ourselves. There's also a lot of commercial products that rely on wetlands to be produced. One of the most important ones is rice. That is a huge food crop globally. A lot of fish and other seafood breed in wetlands, either freshwater or saltwater wetlands, so they're very important for a lot of our seafood organisms. And then things like marshmallows are grown in the wetlands, so a lot of our crops and medicines. And then this is some other things that the wetlands help us do. So they really help with things like groundwater recharge, regulating temperature, by providing a cooler kind of shaded area. Remember that this water is so important for photosynthesis. If we don't have pure water, photosynthesis can't happen, and that's really the basis of all of the food chain. And then in addition to that, photosynthesis is also taking in some of that carbon, so it's regulating our environment in a couple of different ways. So all of these different services show us how important not only wetlands are, but water is as a whole to our environment. Alright, so that's what this unit is going to be all about, is why water is so important and what are the issues that we're having with water at this point in time. Thanks, and I will see you tomorrow.